Welcome back. A little bit of a different episode today. We wanted to take some of the messages we've been seeing the most since we started transforming basketball and just, general things which have aired via different social media platforms. And we wanted to use our platform on the podcast to answer them and put some common kind of challenges to the CLA to rest and actually properly articulate how we would answer those questions from our perspective. So, Adam, first one, I am going to fire over to you. And that is, I want to see results, not science. What basis besides a book, podcast, and fancy words are being used to challenge the status quo? What NBA players have trained with the CLA to confirm that this contemporary approach works?
The two things that come into mind for me are, well, they have trained under the CLA. It just may have not been intentional, first of all. So you don't really necessarily know that. And the other thing I'm thinking about is, so just because it worked for somebody at the highest level, does that mean that was effective? Are we questioning what we're doing? I think we should always be asking, is there a better way? And for me, like, how did you achieve those results? Those this kind of comes back to the same discussion for me around it's something that we had a discussion on initially when we first met, was like, yeah, points per possession is a useful statistics, but it doesn't tell me how it emerged. And if you're going to base your entire offense around that, that's a pretty scary proposition, because then if it's like, let's do threes and layups. Okay,
Adam,
so you're getting what?
I'm just adding analytics and reductionism in analytics, or something like analytics through a CLA lens, to our podcast bank to record. Sorry, I'm cutting you off.
You're perfectly fine. But again, yeah, that's the key word, reducing. It's like, no. I mean, and again, I'm sure there are approaches and stuff like that. Like, again, I'm not going to say, like, to me, it's just it's a very dismissive and simplistic way of looking at a complex world that we live in. It's not as simple as like, oh, A led to B. He did this, therefore that's how it goes.
Yes.
Without even asking, like, well, what elements of it? I can think of a discussion I had with Linus. I keep bringing him up just because I talked to him yesterday about, like, he thought, for instance, that all the work he was putting in the gym, work, quote unquote, being an heavy actually emphasis on the work aspect of it, like shooting in the gym by himself for hours on end, like that's how he got to where he was. And then I just started asking him about his childhood and when he first started playing basketball and first fell in love with it. Turns out that Linus had a park that was less than a block away from his house, and he'd go, and like the older kids were super cool to him, and he would play against them all the time, all day long. And that's when he first fell in love with the sport, and that's
There we
really
go.
he is.
Fantastic. All right, you covered that one really well. What have I got? What's next?
Okay, so I don't know. Like, this kind of confused me because I don't necessarily. I guess it is a question. The science is sitting on a surface level understanding of basketball. Big leaps are made to tie skill acquisition to science.
Yeah, this was a little bit of a confusing one for me, because skill acquisition is science, because it's an evidence-based field. So, there aren't big leaps being made to tie it to basketball, because we've had researchers in universities all over the world who have been studying this, and pioneers within the ecological space, who obviously we've mentioned on many of the podcasts. And, these ideas, especially when we look at what an ecological dynamics approach is, I think it was the early 2000s that the first kind of papers were actually released on this. So it's not something that suddenly has happened, and it's not something that's come from me and you, Adam, where we just decided to record this podcast today and try and change the status quo in the basketball world. No, it's people who have been dedicating their lives to understanding how athletes become more skillful, and actually looking at really challenging traditional approaches to skill acquisition, and obviously challenging the status quo in that field. And so, we can't separate skill acquisition from science. It is science. And obviously it's there for us as coaches not to be scared of it, but to actually embrace it. And I think it's that's the key thing, because it's at the end of the day, skill acquisition can help us design better practice environments backed by empirical evidence. So, you know, that's kind of what I would use to challenge that question, if it's even a question. All right, so next one I have for you, Adam, is CLA coaches create environments which encourage movement solutions, assuming there is no limit to movement solutions that players find. Obviously, I did not write that, full disclaimer. It was a copy and paste. Do your best to try and answer that. I think I know what they're getting at here, Adam.
Well, if you know what they're getting at,
all right, I'll start. So I think what we're seeing here is a coach who is assuming that there are very kind of specific techniques which players need to know. And I think what they are suggesting is that these very specific techniques will not emerge within a CLA environment. And I think they're thinking that, you know, maybe for some players it might happen, but for all players it won't. And I think the easiest starting point is that we don't want all players using highly similar techniques, because as we were talking about before on the podcast, every player solves problems in different ways. And I think at the end of the day, we got to remember that, yes, there is actually no limit to the solutions that could be found. There's many different ways that problems can be solved. And of course, you know, there may be things which are preventing players from moving in different ways. We've spoken about before, action capabilities, attunement to affordances, absolutely. But critically, the key difference is we don't believe in trying to get them to move in one very kind of scripted, coach prescribed way. What would you say to that, Adam?
I would say, like, if you're really honed in on, like, this is quote unquote fundamental to the game, I would say, then what are you worried about? If you put them in the game, eventually that'll happen then. And I think, like, it may, and this speaks to the, like, invariance and attractors and fluctuators within movement, is like, if you provide enough variation and give them enough different experiences, those attractor states and those invariant features of the game that you are seeing, like we certain behaviors you do see in shooting and stuff like that, that are always a part of it. You see it because it's embedded within the environment and the task. It's like, it's unavoidable. It distinguishes between shooting versus a layup. These are different actions because, again, it's different demands, and the more you experience them, they're going to sort out. The body's going to sort out, all right, this is what I do in this under these conditions, and this is what I do under these conditions.
Absolutely. I think the key thing here is it's like we're so creative with how we both manipulate constraints that it's amazing to see all the movement solutions that do emerge. And I think that's where you have to know why you're manipulating constraints, and critically, you know, how to do it in a way which can afford different movement solutions. So next question, we've kind of covered that one. How can a player perform a skill without being first taught it explicitly? How can a youth player that cannot dribble a ball suddenly play one-on-one or a more complex small-sided game? Get those fundamentals down, develop creativity later.
Sadly, like, the first thing I think of is just simply, like, how did you learn to walk and how did you learn to crawl? You just interacted with your environment, and you were trying to stand up. That's what you were initially trying to do. You were trying to traverse the environment and actually get from point A to point B. So you just tried and explored different things over and over again. Now, when it comes to the sport itself, basketball, it's simply exploring within the rules of the game. Like, you can just describe and tell the player, like, oh, no, you're not allowed to do it that way. But you don't necessarily tell them how. You don't have to tell them how to do it. You can just give them the rules. Essentially, the coach early on could be there just to simply provide them the rules of the game. They can almost serve as if they're a referee early on when they're simply exploring and say, nope, you're not allowed to do that. That's all right. And then just change variables that allow them to discover certain movements within the game. Like, you're playing against the rule book. There's no inherent rules, like you have to do it certain ways.
Yeah. And just practically for something like that, play dribble tag. A kid who can't dribble is going to do that. You just got to think about being creative as a coach. And, I don't want to be too mean or nasty here. That's definitely not my intention. But for me, when coaches say those things, I just think it's more of an indictment on their inability to create an effective learning environment. There's always a solution to how we can manipulate constraints, even for beginners. Okay, so maybe last question here, Adam. What have you got for me?
Okay. There are multiple learning styles. I wouldn't want players to organically learn a jump shot when the jump shot took 30 years to appear. Youth players aren't going to reinvent the game quickly. The CLA should be used for some things, but without ignoring best practices that evolved over time.
Okay, so I guess let's start by covering the myth of learning styles. And this would be a very short and easy one for me. There is no theoretical framework for suggesting that learning styles exist. In fact, it's the opposite, and it's actually quite widely known now that there's no such thing as a learning style. So it was something that really emerged, I guess, in the early 2000s or whatever. I remember doing it at school too, but there's no such thing as a learning style. So that's, boom, done. Second one, let's look at the jump shot. So I think, again, this is something we're seeing a lot. And just in terms of reinventing the wheel, it's like, well, within a jump shot, there's certain kind of attractive solutions that players are going to be drawn to. And, when we look at what a jump shot is, the task to shoot the ball with a certain arc into a 10-foot basket means that, there might be some type of similar one-handed jump shot that we see being used in all players, right? That is probably the most optimal way to shoot. It allows players to get consistent outcomes in terms of being able to release the ball quickly over incoming defenders, being able to shoot with enough arc. But the key difference here is that the way the players do that to achieve those outcomes is going to be very different. And that is because of the fact that not only is every player different, but the situation they're confronted by is always different. So, looking at Bernstein's work, he showed us that repetition of a skill is impossible. But furthermore, if we want players to actually achieve similar outcomes, they need to move differently. So this is why, within going back to this jump shot example, we can't just teach the same thing that we've seen done over and over, because we might have been seeing a technique that was good for one player, but it doesn't mean it's going to be good for another one. And that is something we have to understand when we're covering this question. And I'll give you another example. I don't think that we are giving the players enough credit for how they could surprise us, because they may actually reinvent the wheel. And let me give an example of the Fosbury flop technique, which emerged in high jumping. Before, Dick Fosbury coined the famous drop, which every high jumper now does, going over the bar backwards with the head first. Everyone was jumping in different styles. I think it was like traditional, like facing the high jump. And, he came along and he reinvented the whole way that high jumping was done. And what I'm saying is, maybe there's something in basketball that we have not seen yet because we're confined by traditional thinking. And I'm just trying to think of one practical example, Adam. It could be something like shooting off 1 foot. And I'm seeing a WNBA player, Marine Johannes, she does that incredibly well, far quicker, and she's extremely functional doing that. But, it's not because of, how we've traditionally taught shooting over the years. Maybe players are actually being held back from doing things which are a little different to what we conceive them to be right now as coaches.
No, absolutely. Again, I think the word that made me smile was taught, not learn, taught.
Yes.
So you're essentially saying, this is how I see it, therefore this is how it should be done. Many of the innovations that happen within our sport itself happened because of the player, had nothing to do with the coach. It was actually going against the coach. That's typically how these things happen. Bill Russell blocking the shot, jumping to block a shot.
Oh, great example. I put that in the book. Being told not to jump to block. Great example.
I mean, just take even like how Steph Curry plays the game. Like it's like, oh, jump. All the commentary around it was like jump shooting teams can't win championships. And think about how players from the past who could have been doing similar type things, be it a Mark Price or even
Yeah,
like Reggie Miller coming off screens and stuff like that. Like I think like again, it's a very simplified view, and instead of like taking like, wow, these guys are very skillful at this, how could we actually design an offense that like really takes advantage of this? Maybe an offense could be simply run like based off like tons of different floppy action that could really involve other players much more, and
yeah.
it doesn't have to be done a certain way. It's just opening up your bandwidth of what's actually possible for the game.
Fantastic. So, coaches, if you have other questions that you are maybe experiencing in your environment, if you're trying to get your colleagues adopting some of the ideas we share here at Transforming Basketball, let us know the questions that you are getting. And Adam and I will do a part 2 to this episode where we answer those questions. So send them in, and whenever we next get the chance, we'll record and do another one like this. So see you on another episode shortly.